I'm a neurologist at Columbia Parkridge Medical Center in Chattanooga, Tennessee, or at least I was until I submitted my resignation last month. You can call me Dr. Bruce Kaplan if you want. Though most people in the neurology department just called me the brain doctor during my 22 years there, I've seen everything you can imagine in neurology. Strokes, brain tumors, seizure disorders, traumatic injuries, and every kind of damage the human brain can endure. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about consciousness, and ultimately led me to leave the profession entirely. Columbia Parkridge is a major medical center serving southeastern Tennessee and northern Georgia. It's a comprehensive facility with a specialized neurology unit that handles some of the most complex brain injury cases in the region. During my time there, I consulted on hundreds of persistent vegetative state patients, families hoping for miracles, and cases where the line between life and death becomes medically and ethically complex. The case I'm about to tell you about began long before I met the patient. It started on September 17, 1988, in the small mountain town of Walden, Tennessee, about 15 miles northeast of Chattanooga. Officer Gary Dockery was 35 years old and had been working as a police officer for just 3 months. It was a quiet Saturday evening, the kind where the most excitement you might expect would be a minor traffic accident or a noise complaint. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Gary received a 911 call reporting a domestic disturbance. It was routine police work, the kind of call he'd answered dozens of times during his brief career. He drove to the address provided by dispatch, parked his patrol car, and approached the house. What Gary didn't know was that the call was a trap. Samuel Frank Downey, a 68-year-old man with a grudge against the police, had made the false report specifically to lure an officer to his location. Downey was angry about being reprimanded by police for noise complaints from his neighbors, and he had decided to take his revenge on whoever responded to his fake emergency call. When Gary approached the front door and identified himself as a police officer, Downey was waiting with a loaded pistol. Without warning, without giving Gary a chance to draw his weapon or take cover, Downey fired a single shot at point-blank range directly into Gary's forehead. The bullet entered Gary's skull just above his left eyebrow and immediately fragmented into 2 pieces as it tore through his brain tissue. One fragment lodged in the left side of his frontal lobe, while the other traveled toward the back of his skull. The impact was devastating and should have been instantly fatal. Gary collapsed on Downey's front porch, blood pouring from the entrance wound. Neighbors who heard the gunshot called for backup, and within minutes, paramedics and additional officers were on the scene. They found Gary unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, his pulse weak but somehow still detectable. The paramedics rushed him to Erlanger Hospital in Chattanooga, where the trauma team was already waiting. The neurosurgeon on call that night, Dr. Robert Martinez, took one look at the CT scan and knew they were facing a nearly impossible situation. The bullet fragments had caused massive damage to Gary's left frontal lobe, the area of the brain responsible for personality, decision-making, speech, and motor control. There was significant swelling, bleeding, and what appeared to be irreparable destruction of critical brain tissue. Dr. Martinez made the decision to operate immediately. The surgery lasted 8 hours, during which the surgical team removed bone fragments, blood clots, and approximately 20% of Gary's left frontal lobe. They couldn't safely remove the bullet fragments without causing even more damage, so they left them in place and hoped Gary's brain would somehow adapt to their permanent presence. Gary survived the surgery, but barely. For the next 2 weeks, his life hung in the balance as doctors monitored his intracranial pressure, managed his medications, and waited to see if the brain swelling would subside enough for him to regain consciousness. It didn't happen. After a month in the intensive care unit, Gary was transferred to a long-term care facility. The diagnosis was persistent vegetative state, a condition where the patient shows cycles of sleep and wakefulness, but no signs of conscious awareness. His eyes would open and close. He would occasionally grimace or make groaning sounds, but there was no evidence that he was aware of his surroundings or could process information in any meaningful way. This is where I entered Gary's story. though I wouldn't actually meet him for several years. In 1992, I was recruited to Parkridge Medical Center to head up their expanded neurology department. Part of my responsibilities included consulting on long-term care patients throughout the region who showed any changes in their neurological status or whose families were seeking second opinions about prognosis and care decisions. Gary's case file was among the dozens I reviewed during my first months at the hospital. By 1992, Gary had been in his vegetative state for 4 years. I studied his medical records extensively, examined his brain scans, and visited him at the nursing home on Signal Mountain where he was receiving care. What I found was exactly what I expected, based on his medical history. A severely brain-damaged patient with minimal and inconsistent responses to stimuli. Gary could breathe on his own, which was medically encouraging, and suggested that his brainstem, the area responsible for basic life functions, had been spared significant damage. His eyes would track movement occasionally, and sometimes he would blink in response to sudden loud noises. Once in a while, he would squeeze a hand placed in his palm or appear to nod his head slightly when asked a direct question. But these responses were inconsistent and could easily be explained as involuntary reflexes rather than conscious actions. I had seen similar reflexive behaviors in dozens of vegetative patients over the years, and they rarely indicated genuine awareness. Gary's family, particularly his brother Dennis and his 2 sons, Shane and Colt, visited him regularly and insisted that he understood what they were saying. They claimed he would blink once for yes and twice for no when asked simple questions, and that he seemed more alert and responsive when they talked about familiar topics like his horses or memories from before his injury. I was respectfully skeptical of these claims. Family members of vegetative patients often interpret random movements or reflexive behaviors as signs of consciousness because they desperately want to believe their loved one is still in there. It's a natural and completely understandable response, but in my experience, it's rarely based on actual awareness. I examined Gary myself on multiple occasions between 1992 and 1995. Each time, I found the same clinical picture: minimal, inconsistent responses that could not be reliably replicated or attributed to conscious thought. His EEG showed the kind of brainwave patterns typically seen in persistent vegetative state patients, evidence of sleep-wake cycles, but no higher-level cognitive activity or conscious awareness. Gary's long-term prognosis was grim but stable. Patients in persistent vegetative states can sometimes live for many years with proper medical care and attention to preventing complications like pneumonia, bed sores, and infections. However, meaningful recovery after the first year is extremely rare. After 4 or 5 years, it becomes virtually impossible from a neurological standpoint. By early 1996, Gary had been in this state for over 7 years. His case had become routine in my practice. Periodic consultations to monitor his condition, adjust medications as needed, and provide guidance to his family about care decisions, but no expectation of meaningful neurological change. That all changed dramatically over the weekend of February 10th and 11th, 1996. Gary had developed pneumonia, a common and potentially life-threatening complication for long-term care patients who are immobilized and dependent on others for basic needs. His condition deteriorated rapidly over that weekend, and by Saturday night, he was running a dangerously high fever of 104 degrees Fahrenheit and having significant difficulty breathing. The nursing home staff called an ambulance, and Gary was transported to Parkridge Medical Center, where I was called in as the consulting neurologist because of his complex medical history and my familiarity with his case. When I examined Gary in the emergency department late Saturday night, his condition appeared critical. The pneumonia was severe, affecting both lungs, and the extremely high fever was putting additional stress on his already compromised brain. His neurological responses were even more minimal than usual. He wasn't even showing his typical occasional eye-tracking movements or reflexive responses to stimuli. Dr. James Folkening, our staff pulmonologist, examined Gary and determined that he needed immediate and aggressive intervention to clear the fluid from his lungs and combat the infection. The family was faced with an agonizing decision: allow Gary to die peacefully from the pneumonia or put him through intensive treatment, including possible surgical intervention, which might save his life, but would certainly not improve his underlying neurological condition. I spent considerable time that Saturday night talking with Gary's brother Dennis about the medical realities of the situation. Dennis had been Gary's primary advocate and decision-maker for nearly 8 years, and the emotional toll of watching his brother in this condition was evident. "Dr. Kaplan, he's been fighting for so long," Dennis told me, his voice heavy with exhaustion and grief. "Part of me wonders if we should just let him go. But what if he can hear us? What if he's been aware all this time and we give up on him now?" I explained the medical facts as gently but honestly as I could. "Dennis, I understand your hope, and I've seen your dedication to Gary over all these years. But you need to understand that Gary's brain injury is extensive and permanent. The damage to his frontal lobe, the location of the bullet fragments, the length of time he's been in this state, all of these factors make meaningful recovery impossible from a neurological standpoint. But he responds to us sometimes. He blinks when we ask questions. He seems to recognize voices. I know it seems that way, and I understand why you interpret those movements as responses. But what you're seeing are most likely reflexive behaviors, not conscious responses. The brain can produce these reflexes even in the absence of conscious awareness." The family ultimately decided to proceed with aggressive treatment. Gary was admitted to the intensive care unit, placed on intravenous antibiotics, and given supportive care to manage his fever and breathing difficulties. Dr. Folkening scheduled surgery for Monday morning to drain fluid from Gary's lungs if the antibiotics didn't show rapid improvement. On Sunday evening, February 11th, I made my routine evening rounds in the ICU. Gary's fever had begun to respond to the antibiotics, dropping from 104 to 101 degrees Fahrenheit. His breathing was still labored, but he appeared to be stabilizing from a pulmonary standpoint. I noted in his chart that his neurological status was unchanged from my previous examinations. Minimal responses, eyes closed most of the time, no evidence of conscious awareness or meaningful interaction with his environment. At approximately 4 a.m. on Monday, February 12, 1996, I received a phone call from the ICU nurse that would fundamentally change everything I thought I knew about brain injury, consciousness, and the nature of human awareness. "Dr. Kaplan, you need to get down here immediately," the nurse said, her voice tight with excitement and confusion. "It's Gary Dockery. He's awake and he's talking." I was certain I had misheard her. After 7.5 years of persistent vegetative state, Gary couldn't simply wake up and start talking. It was neurologically impossible. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "Gary Dockery is awake and alert. He's been talking to his sister for the past hour. He's asking questions and responding normally to conversation." I hung up the phone and drove to the hospital as quickly as I could, convinced that there had been some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. Perhaps Gary was making vocalizations that the family was interpreting as words, or maybe he was having some kind of seizure activity that was causing unusual movements or sounds. When I arrived in the ICU at 4:45 a.m., I encountered a scene that defied every principle of neurology I had learned during my medical training and career. Gary Dockery was sitting up in his hospital bed, fully alert and engaged in animated conversation with his sister Lisa. His eyes were bright, focused, and tracking people around the room with obvious intelligence and recognition. When he saw me approach his bedside, he looked directly at me and said, "Are you Dr. Kaplan? Lisa was just telling me I've got pneumonia. How serious is it?" I stood there speechless for several moments, trying to process what I was witnessing. This was not the same patient I had examined just 8 hours earlier. The Gary Dockery I knew was minimally responsive, locked in a persistent vegetative state, unable to communicate beyond occasional reflexive movements. This Gary was alert, articulate, and completely aware of his surroundings. "Gary," I said slowly, pulling up a chair beside his bed, "do you know where you are?" "I'm in the hospital," he replied without hesitation. "Lisa says I've got pneumonia and that you folks have been taking good care of me. I feel much better than I did yesterday. Do you remember what happened to you? Do you remember why you're in the hospital? Gary's expression became thoughtful and slightly puzzled. Well, I remember being really sick, really sick, like I've been sleeping for a very long time. But I'm not sure exactly what happened. Lisa says it's been a while since I've been well. I looked at Lisa, who was staring at her brother with tears streaming down her face. She had been visiting Gary regularly for over 7 years, talking to him, reading to him, sharing news about family and friends, hoping against hope for some sign that he could hear her. And now suddenly, he was not only hearing her, but responding to her as if they had been having conversations all along. Gary, what's the last thing you remember clearly before being sick? He thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. I remember working security at UC, the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. That was my job. I was working third shift, and I remember it being cold outside. Gary's last clear memory was from his job as a security guard at the University of Tennessee, a position he had held several years before becoming a police officer in Walden. He had no memory of his police work, no memory of the shooting that had put him in this condition, and no awareness that he had been unresponsive for nearly 8 years. Over the next several hours, I conducted what would become the most extraordinary and puzzling neurological examination of my entire career. Gary's cognitive function appeared to be remarkably intact despite the extensive brain damage I knew he had sustained. He could perform basic mental arithmetic, recall detailed information from his past, and engage in complex conversations about a wide range of topics. His speech was clear and grammatically correct. His responses were appropriate and contextual. His memory for events prior to his injury was excellent, though he seemed to have no recollection of anything that had happened since 1988. Most incredibly, his personality appeared to be completely unchanged from what his family described before the shooting. He was making jokes, asking specific questions about his horses by name, and requesting to speak with old friends. It was as if someone had simply pressed a pause button on his consciousness for 7.5 years and then suddenly pressed play again. But there were significant physical limitations that reminded me of the reality of his brain injury. Gary was paralyzed from the chest down, unable to move his legs or control his bladder and bowel functions. His fine motor control in his hands was significantly impaired, though he could grip objects and gesture while speaking. These physical deficits were entirely consistent with the damage to his frontal lobe and motor cortex. I immediately called in every neurological specialist I could reach. Over the course of that Monday, Gary was examined by multiple neurologists, neurosurgeons, neuropsychologists, and psychiatrists, each one as baffled as I was by his sudden and seemingly complete cognitive recovery. We ordered immediate brain imaging studies, comprehensive blood tests, and every diagnostic tool available to us to try to understand what had happened to Gary's brain during the night. The results were just as puzzling as Gary's behavior. His CT scans and MRI showed exactly the same extensive damage that had been documented for years. The missing frontal lobe tissue, the bullet fragments still embedded in his brain, the areas of scarring and atrophy from his original injury. There was no evidence of new growth, healing, or any physical change that could explain his recovery. His blood work showed the effects of his pneumonia treatment and recovery, but nothing that would account for a neurological awakening. Most remarkably, his EEG, which had shown vegetative state patterns for years, now displayed completely normal waking brainwave patterns with clear evidence of conscious thought and awareness. Gary spent that entire Monday talking almost non-stop. He spoke with family members who rushed to the hospital from across several states. He talked to old friends who were called to verify that this was really Gary they were speaking with and that his personality and memories were intact. He asked for detailed updates on his sons, who were now 12 and 20 years old, though he remembered them as small children of 5 and 12. The conversation that affected me most deeply was when Gary asked about the passage of time. His brother Dennis had been reluctant to tell him exactly how long he had been unconscious, but Gary was persistent in his questions. Dennis, how long have I been sick? Lisa said it's been a few years, but I feel like it's been much longer than that. Dennis looked at me, then back at his brother. "Gary, it's been 7.5 years, almost 8 years since your injury." Gary absorbed this information with remarkable calm. He was quiet for several minutes, then said, 7.5 years. That's a long time. That explains why I feel like I've been sleeping forever, and why the boys have grown so much. He asked practical questions about what had happened during those years, who was president, what major events had occurred, how the family had been managing. When told that the Berlin Wall had fallen and the Soviet Union had collapsed, Gary said, "Well, I guess I missed some important history." As that remarkable Monday progressed, I began to notice subtle changes in Gary's level of responsiveness. His speech remained clear and appropriate, but he was initiating fewer conversations on his own. By evening, he was still answering questions appropriately and recognizing everyone who visited him. But the animated, almost manic quality of his communication from earlier in the day had diminished somewhat. On Tuesday, February 13th, Gary spoke less frequently, but was still clearly conscious and responsive when directly addressed. He answered questions appropriately and seemed to understand everything that was said to him. However, the complex conversations and detailed recollections that had characterized Monday were no longer happening with the same frequency or intensity. By Wednesday, February 14th, Gary was responding primarily with yes or no answers and simple phrases rather than the elaborate sentences and stories he had shared just 2 days earlier. It was as if he was gradually sliding back toward his previous state, though he was still clearly more aware and responsive than he had been during the previous 7 years. On Thursday, February 15th, Gary underwent the lung surgery that Dr. Folkening had originally scheduled for Monday morning. The surgical procedure went well from a pulmonary standpoint, but when Gary emerged from anesthesia, his brief window of full consciousness appeared to have largely closed. He was awake and alert following the surgery, but no longer speaking in complete sentences or initiating conversation. When Dr. Folkening asked him what time it was, Gary replied, "Night," even though it was mid-afternoon. When asked his name, he would sometimes respond correctly, but often gave no response at all. Over the following weeks and months, Gary would occasionally respond to direct questions with single words or short phrases. Sometimes he would correctly identify family members or answer simple yes or no questions. But the Gary who had talked enthusiastically for hours about his horses, his memories, and his family was gone, apparently returned to the locked-in state that had defined the previous 7 years of his life. I spent the next several months obsessively trying to understand what had happened to Gary Dockery during those remarkable 18 hours of consciousness. I consulted with colleagues at major medical centers across the country, reviewed every piece of medical literature I could find on persistent vegetative state and consciousness, and ran every conceivable test to try to explain his temporary awakening. The most logical medical explanation seemed to be related to his pneumonia and treatment. The extremely high fever from his infection, combined with the powerful antibiotics and other medications he received, might have temporarily altered his brain chemistry in a way that allowed dormant or suppressed neural pathways to function normally. But when we tried to replicate this effect by administering the same medications in the same doses and sequence, nothing happened. Gary remained in his minimally responsive state, showing no signs of the consciousness he had demonstrated in February. Other neurological experts I consulted suggested that Gary's awakening might have been triggered by the physiological stress of his severe illness, or possibly that he had somehow been aware of his family's discussions about his treatment options, and that the threat of death had activated a neurological response that had been suppressed for years. But none of these theories could fully explain why Gary had awakened with such complete cognitive function, why his personality and memories had been perfectly preserved, why his awakening had lasted almost exactly 18 hours, or why he had gradually returned to his previous state, despite our continued medical interventions and attempts to maintain his consciousness. The case attracted significant national and international attention from both medical professionals and the media. News outlets dubbed Gary the miracle patient and the coma cop. Medical journals published detailed case reports and analyses of his temporary recovery. Neurologists, neurosurgeons, and consciousness researchers from around the world contacted me to discuss the implications of his awakening for our understanding of brain injury and persistent vegetative states. But for all the attention, analysis, and speculation, Gary's 18 hours of consciousness remained fundamentally unexplained from a medical and scientific standpoint. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Gary's case, from my perspective as his neurologist, was what it suggested about his level of awareness during the 7.5 years of apparent unconsciousness that preceded his awakening. If Gary could wake up and immediately engage in complex, contextually appropriate conversations, if he could recognize family members he hadn't consciously interacted with for nearly 8 years, if he could recall detailed information from his past and demonstrate intact personality and cognitive function, then how much had he been aware of during those years of silence? I began to reconsider every interaction I had witnessed between Gary and his family over the years. When they claimed he was responding to questions with specific blink patterns, when they insisted he seemed more alert and responsive during certain conversations, when they reported that he appeared to recognize familiar voices and seemed to track people's movements around his room, maybe they had been right all along. The possibility that Gary had been conscious, or at least partially aware, for 7.5 years while appearing to be in a persistent vegetative state was profoundly troubling to me, both as a physician and as a human being. It raised fundamental questions about how many other patients might be trapped in similar conditions, aware of their surroundings but unable to communicate their consciousness to the outside world. Gary's family became convinced that he had been listening to every conversation, absorbing every piece of news they had shared with him, hearing every prayer and expression of love they had offered during those long years of waiting. They believed that his sudden awakening was his way of letting them know that he had been there all along, present and aware, just unable to respond. I wanted to dismiss this interpretation as wishful thinking or the natural human tendency to find meaning in random events. But Gary's detailed recollections, his preserved personality, his appropriate emotional responses, and his immediate recognition of people he hadn't consciously seen for years made it very difficult to argue that he had simply turned on like a light switch after years of complete unconsciousness. Gary Dockery died on April 15, 1997, 13 months after his miraculous 18-hour awakening. He had developed a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in his lung, which is a common and often fatal complication for patients with severe mobility limitations. His death was not unexpected given his overall medical condition and the inherent risks associated with long-term immobilization. But it marked the end of one of the most puzzling and significant cases in the medical literature on consciousness and persistent vegetative states. In the months between his brief awakening and his death, Gary occasionally spoke single words or short phrases in response to direct questions or stimulation, but he never again experienced the kind of sustained, fully conscious communication he had demonstrated during those 18 hours in February 1996. It was as if he had been given a brief reprieve from his neurological imprisonment, allowed to reconnect with his family, and let them know he was still present before returning to the locked-in state that had defined most of his final years. Gary's case fundamentally changed how I approached neurology and patient care. I became much more cautious about declaring patients to be permanently unconscious or without hope of meaningful recovery. I started paying much closer attention to family members who insisted their loved ones were showing subtle signs of awareness that standard medical tests and examinations couldn't detect or measure. I also became deeply involved in research into consciousness, persistent vegetative states, and the development of better diagnostic tools for detecting minimal levels of awareness in brain-injured patients. Gary's case demonstrated that our understanding of consciousness and brain function was still incomplete, and that patients who appeared to be completely unconscious might be experiencing far more awareness than we realized. But more than changing my medical practice, Gary's case affected me on a personal and philosophical level in ways that I struggled to process and understand. For months after his death, I found myself lying awake at night, thinking about the implications of what I had witnessed. If Gary had been aware during those 7 years of apparent unconsciousness, what had that experience been like for him? Had he been frustrated by his inability to communicate? Had he heard every conversation, felt every touch, understood every medical decision being made about his care? The thought of being consciously trapped in an unresponsive body for years was almost too horrifying to contemplate. I began questioning my interactions with every vegetative patient I consulted on. During examinations, I found myself wondering, are they listening? Do they understand what I'm saying about their prognosis? Are they aware that their families are making end-of-life decisions based on my assessment that they're unconscious? The weight of these questions began to affect my ability to function as a neurologist. I started second-guessing my clinical judgments, spending excessive amounts of time with vegetative patients looking for subtle signs of awareness, and struggling to provide families with the definitive assessments they needed to make difficult care decisions. 6 months after Gary's death, I was consulting on a similar case. A young woman who had been in a persistent vegetative state for 3 years following a car accident. As I was explaining to her family that her condition was permanent and that she showed no signs of awareness, I noticed what appeared to be a tear rolling down her cheek. Her family insisted that she cried when they talked about sad topics, and that her facial expressions changed in response to different conversations. I had attributed these responses to autonomic reflexes and coincidental timing. But after Gary's case, I found myself wondering, what if I was wrong? What if she was listening to every word I said about her hopeless prognosis? I completed that consultation, but I knew I couldn't continue practicing neurology with the level of uncertainty and doubt that Gary's case had created for me. How could I authoritatively tell families that their loved ones were unconscious when I had seen the impossible happen once before? I submitted my resignation from Parkridge Medical Center 3 weeks later. In my resignation letter, I wrote that I was leaving to pursue other opportunities, but the truth was that Gary Dockery's case had shaken my confidence in everything I thought I knew about the brain, consciousness, and the nature of human awareness. I moved to a smaller city and opened a general practice focused on routine medical care, diabetes management, hypertension, preventive care, and other conditions with clear diagnostic criteria and established treatment protocols. I deliberately avoided any cases involving neurology, brain injuries, or questions of consciousness. But I never stopped thinking about Gary. I followed the medical literature on consciousness research, persistent vegetative states, and advances in brain imaging technology that might help detect minimal awareness in seemingly unconscious patients. I was encouraged by developments in functional MRI and other techniques that seemed to show promise for identifying conscious thought in unresponsive patients. The case of Gary Dockery remains one of the most well-documented and thoroughly studied examples of unexpected recovery from persistent vegetative state in the medical literature. It continues to be cited in research papers, discussed at medical conferences, and referenced in debates about consciousness, end-of-life care, and the ethical treatment of brain-injured patients. But for me, Gary's case represents something more than a medical anomaly or research curiosity. It serves as a profound reminder of the limitations of medical knowledge and the mysteries that still surround human consciousness. It's a humbling experience for any physician to encounter a case that completely challenges their understanding of their field of expertise and forces them to confront the possibility that some of their most fundamental assumptions might be wrong. Gary Dockery shouldn't have woken up. According to everything we know about brain injury, persistent vegetative states, and the neurological basis of consciousness, his awakening was medically impossible. The extent of his brain damage, the length of time he had been unresponsive, and the lack of any significant change in his brain imaging studies should have precluded any possibility of meaningful recovery. But he did wake up. For 18 hours, Gary Dockery was fully conscious, cognitively intact, and able to communicate with his family in ways that demonstrated preserved personality, memory, and awareness. It was a medical phenomenon that defied explanation then and continues to challenge our understanding of the human brain and consciousness today. The most important lesson from Gary's case may not be medical or scientific, but deeply human. It reminds us that the people we label as vegetative, unconscious, or unaware may be far more present than we realize. It suggests that consciousness might persist in places and ways that our current medical understanding cannot detect or measure. Gary's 18 hours of impossible consciousness gave his family the gift of knowing that he had been there all along, listening and aware, even when he couldn't show it. It allowed them to say goodbye, to express their love, and to receive his reassurance that their years of devotion and hope had not been in vain. For the medical community, Gary's case serves as a compelling argument for approaching all brain-injured patients with the assumption that consciousness and awareness may persist even when conventional tests suggest otherwise. It reminds us that the boundary between conscious and unconscious, between aware and vegetative, may be far more complex and mysterious than we currently understand. The case of Gary Dockery will always remain, for me, the most unexplained and humbling experience of my medical career. It taught me that medicine, for all its advances and sophistication, still contains profound mysteries that challenge our most basic assumptions about life, consciousness, and what it means to be truly awake.